Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of political philosophy by looking at a really interesting paper by a contemporary philosopher named Alan Wood. Wood is one of the leading scholars on Immanuel Kant, as well as another German philosopher, Fichte, but he has worthwhile and interesting things to say about Karl Marx as well. And this paper can be seen as sort of a wide scope reflection on some of how Marx's theories apply to our contemporary world today. So, here's the plan for our discussion of Wood's paper. I want to look at the difference between moralized and non-moralized definitions of this concept of exploitation. Now, Wood is then going to give us a definition of exploitation, and his definition is going to be a non-moralized definition of exploitation. More or less, his definition will allow for the thought that sometimes it is wrong and unjust to exploit somebody, but in other situations, there might be nothing wrong or nothing unjust with exploitation. Once we figure out what injustice comes to, he will point out that there can be a way of thinking about injustice that doesn't involve any identifiable wrongdoer. And we'll finish with some general reflections about how Marx's thinking can still apply to capitalism today, if it can at all. So, moralized versus non-moralized definitions of exploitation. We'll remember when we looked at value, price, profit from Marx, one of his key conclusions, really, is that the capitalist system of producing goods under a situation of workers alienating their labor, even though they're adding value to products, is that capitalists will be exploiting workers. Now, we might think of that as a straightforward moral claim, because many people define the word exploitation to mean a transaction whose terms are unjust or unfair. These thinkers that Wood is going to criticize, they say, well, in these situations where we have a transaction between two parties, only if there is some unfair bargaining situation do we call it an exploitative transaction. If the parties are entering into the contract perhaps fully voluntarily, or everybody's getting a fair shake out of the deal, in that case, we wouldn't call it exploitation anymore. But Wood points out, he's going to say that whether a transaction is fair or not isn't a straightforward, cut and dry question. We can't apply a simple formula to figure out what is fair or not fair, he says. And instead, it's going to be a contextual matter, which is going to be sensitive to particular features of a situation, maybe also societal norms. So for Wood, he's going to think that some moralized concepts of justice are going to try to think about all human interactions in terms of unfair market interactions. And he says that this way of trying to understand everything in terms of market interactions is a mistake. He says that this reduces humanity to something economic in a way that Wood doesn't like. But instead of thinking about exploitation as something that is inherently unjust or unfair, Wood is going to say, well, exploitation is a description of the world, but it doesn't tell us what we should do. We might say it's a descriptive claim without being a normative claim. Normative just being the language of what you should do or what's good to do. The way that Wood thinks about it is that certain objective facts in the world, those will be objective reasons for thinking that something is good, bad, right, wrong, just, or unjust. And his view holds that we should shape our principles, intuitions, and attitudes according to what is objectively true. So, the way that Wood is thinking about this, we don't want to build the wrongness of exploitation right into the world, but we want to think about wrongness as an effect of the objective facts in the world. So as we build out here with exploitation as an objective fact in the world, we might think of, well, what kind of fact are we talking about? Well, here's one thing that he's going to suggest to us in order to give us a sense that the term exploitation could be non-moralized. He says that there are situations where we might congratulate a lawyer, right, for exploiting the weakness of an opponent's case. So if they notice that the opposing side isn't able to answer a certain question, they might push that question, get that question right to the front of the conversation, and then win the case on the basis of their inability to answer that question. You're exploiting the weakness of the opponent's case. We might say that's exploitation that is neither good nor bad. It just is. We might, again, admire rather than blame a baseball manager who exploits his players' base stealing skills. So, for instance, if you have a really great base stealer on first, you might strategically find a time to tell him to steal, and in that way, you might sort of take advantage of that opportunity. So in this way, we could think of that as another example of exploiting, but exploiting that we don't find inherently unjust or inherently blameworthy. Now, maybe we could think of these cases as exploiting a person's ability or exploiting a situation, and what we're not supposed to do is exploit people. But Wood doesn't think that that line of thought ultimately works, because we might say that aren't we exploiting a person when we say notice that they have certain skills and then we employ them to our benefit. So as we start to build up this non-moralized definition of exploitation, here's how Wood is going to define exploitation. He's going to say that when you exploit something or someone, you have to fit that thing or person into a plan or project of yours involving your control over the thing that you use. So I think that the key words here are you have a plan, you use something in your plan, and you use it through exertion of control. So for instance, if I get to school by taking the bus, I might use the bus driver's abilities and punctuality in order to get to school on time. So I'm using that person in my plan, but I'm not exerting control over them, right? So we might think of it as finding ways to get different behaviors out of people in a way that's planned towards a larger goal, and yeah, we're using somebody for a benefit. And Wood at this point will say, capital's relationship to labor, so when the capitalist figures out how to set a wage and how to add value to raw goods, say in a manufacturing context, this sort of relationship is an exploitative relationship because the capitalist has a plan to make a profit. They use the worker's ability. And we might also say that by setting the wage at a right standard and by having the terms of the job set up in a certain way, that is a way of exerting control. Now, he does say it's not only employers who can exploit, but he's going to say that who is exploiting who in a plan is dependent on who is in control. And when we think about control, we can also think about it in terms of one party being vulnerable to the other. So it's usually the case that employees are vulnerable to their employer in a way that employers are not vulnerable to their employees. So Anderson pointed this out in our private government reading. Well, it is the case that both an employee and an employer can exit a contractual relationship and discontinue it. When an employee quits, they're not firing their boss. But when an an employee is not renewed for a contract, that is them being fired by their employer, basically. But Wood will point out a superstar athlete is an employee of their team. But say if you have a star player, if you're thinking of somebody like Kobe Bryant or LeBron James, we might think of the way that they are able to, were able to, garner large contracts from the LA Lakers by saying, if you don't pay me this much, I'll go play for some other team. And in that way, they might exert control over the team. So we might think of cases where an employee can exploit an employer, but these cases, Wood will say, are rarer. Now, he's basically said we can use this definition of exploitation to descriptively identify instances of exploitation in the world. But he's going to say, on a non-moralized definition, exploitation might be an injustice, but it might not. And now Wood is going to look at this question of when exploitation actually does also have this normative moral dimension to it. First thing that he's going to note is that we might have some cases of exploitation that are morally problematic without having them being unjust. Here's what Wood means. He says you might exploit the emotions of a friend or a lover. Now, this would be morally bad. So if you tell a romantic partner, you'd better do this for me in order to prove that you really love me, you might think that that is exploitative, right? It is exerting control over a person and a plan by manipulating them in a certain way. So we are playing on the vulnerabilities of that romantic partner. Now, the thing that Wood will point out is that this sort of behavior is cruel and unkind, and it doesn't respect the autonomy of the other partner in the relationship when we do this kind of thing of exploiting somebody's capacity for guilt, let's say. So Wood is definitely on board with the idea that this is morally wrong when, say, friends or lovers exploit the emotions of those that they're dealing with, right? But here's the point that Wood wants to make. Even though this sort of exploitation is morally wrong, he's going to say these cases are not injustices, because injustice is a matter of, as he puts it, violating somebody's rights that ought to be protected by law, right? And I think that most of us believe that even though, the lover who exploits their partner's emotions is a bad person, and that we hope that their partner will eventually come to that realization and leave them even, most of us would also probably agree that if there's no physical violence, this sort of emotional manipulation isn't the sort of thing that law or the courts should be involved in, right? So in those cases, we might say that these are wrong things to do, but it's not a matter of a rights violation that the law should be protecting against. So, as Wood puts it, when we're thinking in terms of justice, we're thinking about not just any kind of moral wrong, but maybe the sorts of moral wrongs that involve rights violations that a properly functioning state would intervene to protect. Now, we'll notice that when we're talking about what you have a right to, Wood, and as a Kant scholar, says we're not focusing on the consequences or the welfare of those affected by actions, but instead he's going to say, really we're thinking about freedom and justice. And in particular, when we're thinking about freedom, we're thinking about this Republican sense of being free when you are not being dominated by others. So the way that Wood thinks about it, he's going to say that you want to make sure that people in their interactions with others are not being exploited in a way where they're being made unfree. And another way to put this domination or unfreedom is to talk about when a person is being coerced. And when we're talking about coercion, we're saying you're in a situation where you're given no choice but to do what the other party is trying to get you to do. The simplest and most straightforward example of coercion that I can think of, and which can be like a good starting and guiding thought, is the example of the mugger who puts a gun to your head and says, well, it's going to be your wallet or your life. Right? So in this situation, you might say that you haven't been given a choice. You just have to give the mugger your wallet at that point. But others might point out, well, sort of. You still do have a choice, right? You could hold your money and take the risk of getting shot, right? But we might think that even the risk of getting shot, no less being shot, we might think that that's something that we would find objectively unacceptable. So when we're thinking about unacceptable options, we might think of an unacceptable option as an option where you are being asked to give up or risk or forego something that you shouldn't be made to risk or forego or give up. So we might think that this could be a situation where, well, your life and your money and your property, it's unacceptable to just be separated from them. So we might think of that as a situation of being coerced. Now, Wood even points out that in some situations, a person might be exploited without being made worse off. And they might be coerced without being made worse off. Because we might think of a person who is coerced. They have no other option but to stay in their job, right? And maybe the job pays well enough, right? But we can still think of it as exploitation because the employer is exerting control over the person in service of their plans. But we might also think if the wage is good enough, but there aren't any other options, we could think of a situation as being exploitative and coercive, even if, say, a person likes their job. If there are no other acceptable options, then we would think of it as coerced. So, what's interesting in Wood's analysis is he will then go on to say that it's not even necessarily that in a situation where we have somebody being made better off by being in an employment contract, an exploitative employment contract, but still, a contract that they like, if there aren't enough options on the table for a person, we could say that, look, you can be coerced into a position even if it's the situation of society rather than the employer that makes your choice coerced. Because you might be in a situation where you say, like, look, either I'm going to take this low-paying job or else I will see my family starve. We might say there are no acceptable alternatives to the job, right? And in that way, we might say it's less free than if there were a number of jobs that a person had to choose from. And Marx will point out, along with Wood, that in an economic system, it's completely understandable that employing capitalists will need to employ workers and exploit their labor. Right? There is no other viable option for the capitalist to make their own way in the world. And Wood says that we can think of this as an example of what might be called general injustice. It's people being made unfree. They don't have enough acceptable options. And it's not really because of the choices of any particular individual, not even any particular employer, but it's because of the social system. And the social system takes options away from the citizen. Now, in this situation, Wood will point out to us that this may be where the state should intervene. So to take one example, there are a certain number of people who will stay in their jobs that they'd rather not stay in, because to lose their job would be to lose their healthcare insurance for themselves and their families. And we might think of that as staying employed, but not being freely employed. And one suggestion that we might make, I don't think I'm putting too many words in Kant's mouth, if that is a good example of an unfree situation for the employee, where it is a general injustice, it should be the job of the state to give that person more options. So one thing that might be done is to make it such that healthcare is provided by the state. And then we say, like, look, you can leave the job and still not lose basic protections for yourself and your family. So this leads us to the question of whether capitalism is a case of unjust exploitation. Wood says this: the basic condition under which capitalism constitutes a general injustice, that is, people are made unfree, and particularly when workers are made unfree, is one in which the capitalist class collectively exercises private ownership over the conditions under which workers may labor and live. So it seems that one suggestion is that if workers don't have control over how society is set up, if more or less like the moneyed ruling class is basically determining the choice set for everybody in society, that will set the conditions of labor and the conditions of living. And that would be an unacceptable constraint on freedom. But Wood also recognizes that, Kant, like many other philosophers, will recognize that there's nothing inherently unjust about entering into a wage contract, right? It's quite a reasonable thing that sometimes I will willingly be employed, and I will be better off for taking the employment, and those who employ me will be better off for having received my services. But just because there's nothing inherently unjust about entering into a wage contract, for Wood, there's nothing inherently unjust about entering into even an exploitative wage contract. We might still recognize that some iterations of the wage contract will be connected to general injustices, social structures that make our choices less free than they could have been otherwise. So here's a little passage to close on. Wood says this: as I see it, Marx's deepest and most lasting insight here is this: the concept and the institution of the right of private property, and consequently the concept and institution of the modern political state founded upon them, is fundamentally justified by the way the institution of private property was necessary to protect individual human freedom. This is an interesting thought. So we might think that the Lockean theory that says, look, you have a right to not only your own body, but you also have the right to the value that you can produce in other things through the labor of your body. We might think that protecting your property is a way to make you more free. But continuing the quote, but the historical processes in the modern period has resulted in a contradiction. Most private property takes the form of capital, and when this happens, private property ceases to be a protection for individual freedom and instead condemns the vast majority who labor to a condition of servitude. So this is the puzzle. Property rights were originally created to make us more free, but When property rights are then used in a system of capitalism, we find a concentration of wealth and power among, a small, moneyed, ruling caste of capitalists, right? And on this ground, we might think that the way that history has moved has sort of undercut the original mission of the right of private property. So I think that this leaves us with an analysis of perhaps why many people are concerned about inequality in these contemporary times. Property rights in and of themselves might not be a bad thing, but the way that property rights have been exploited and manipulated in certain ways have undercut their main function. Now, Wood sort of ends with some questions about, well, if this Marxist analysis is right, there are some questions, right? A big question that the Marxist will encounter is the question of if there is really a situation of contradiction in capitalism, Marx will tell us that it's not sustainable, that it won't last, that we'll have to move beyond it. But since Marx's time in the 19th century, capitalism has proved to be robust and adaptable. In this way, we might wonder if Marx's analysis of capitalism as contradictory and unsustainable has been perhaps empirically falsified, right? And it seems that one possible answer to the situation is that even though capitalism might be exploitative, there might still be ways of passing laws to address, as we've seen them called, general injustices. And by passing these laws, capitalism could be made sustainable rather than simply running itself into the ground or contradicting itself out of existence. But this question of whether capitalism can last or where we're going to go from here is certainly a live debate for scholars and a valuable one for anybody to think about. So we'll finish our discussion there for today. We're going to continue this theme of distributive justice next week by looking at a couple of classics in American liberalism, right? So we're going to look at Anarchy, State, and Utopia, some excerpts from that book by Robert Nozick, as well as A Theory of Justice by John Rawls. So that's where we're going to take things next time. Thanks for listening in. And as always, please don't be shy about reaching out if any questions or concerns or observations emerge. So thanks for listening in, and take care.